NFL draft season can be a complete minefield for prospect evaluations. Finding the opinions you can trust is more valuable now than ever, and that's why we're bringing on some of your favorite fantasy football experts to break down 3 players they can't wait to draft from this class. In this video, we're joined by the one, the only Zachariason of Late Round Quarterback to dive into it. JJ, how excited are you for this draft class?
I'm pretty excited, man. I think the running back group is probably the best that we've seen since 2017. The wide receivers, not as strong as like what we saw last year, but there's definitely some players in there that should be able to contribute. So I think overall, the tight end class is okay too. I think overall, we're looking at a pretty solid group for fantasy purposes.
Rich, you published your 2025 rookie guide this morning. So obviously JJ's talking about how great this class is, but what's your biggest question you've got left with 5 weeks up to the draft?
I think it's the quarterbacks, isn't it? Let's be honest. Like at the moment, it's looking like one surefire high draft pick. Outside of that, I don't know. Like you could tell me Shedeur Sanders goes 2. You could tell me Jackson Dart goes in the top 5. You could tell me neither of them are first round picks. Like I'm fascinated to really understand what the NFL think about the second tier of quarterbacks, because it looks like and sounds like Cam Ward is locked in for that first overall pick.
Yeah, JJ, you mentioned the running backs, you mentioned the tight ends, you mentioned the quarterbacks, but one area which this class perhaps isn't the best is the wide receiver. But we're going to start with the wide receiver position and Jaylin Noel, who wide receiver out of Iowa, a pretty exciting player in plenty of areas. JJ, I've seen some draft pundits suggesting that Noel's biggest impact could be in the return game because of the change to the dynamic kickoffs. What is it in particular that makes you so excited to draft Jaylin Noel?
Yeah, I look at stuff analytically, first and foremost. I watch all these guys too, because I don't want to sound like a moron whenever I'm writing up their profiles for my guide or when I'm talking to you guys, on shows and such. But, with Jaylin Noel, the thing that stood out to me analytically was that he was just really solid across the board, at least compared to the other wide receivers in this class. I have a metric called breakout score that I use, which is age and program adjusted yards per team pass attempt. So he was 76th percentile within breakout score. He was 61st percentile in top season receiving yards per team pass attempt. He was 58th in career yards per route run. So he was just, above average to really good in most categories that I'm going to be looking at. And he did all that while playing alongside Jaden Higgins, who is getting steamed up a little bit. Like I wouldn't be shocked if we see Higgins get like fringe first round love, like as we get closer and closer to the draft, because that's what we tend to do with wide receivers, that are especially his size and has his ability and his speed. Teams are going to really love that. So, with Noel, the fact that he played with Higgins and he was still able to compile the numbers that he did, that's great. He did play a lot in the slot, but the thing that I like about Noel and his deployment was that he had a year where he had an ADOT, an average at the target of just 2.7 yards. But then, you look at last year, he had more 20 plus yard throws or targets than Jaden Higgins did. So he can get down the field. He's not just like a, as folks would say, a slot merchant out there, just getting looks, in these easy looks out of the slot. He also, another thing, this is a more subjective thing that I look at that doesn't necessarily get thrown into my model, but he played special teams. That's always a signal of talent. Someone who can play in the return game a little bit, because in college, these coaches are putting their best players out there regardless of who they are, and because they're only going to be there for at most 4 years for the most part. I know a lot of players are sticking around longer now, but these guys they want to get their best players the ball and get the ball in their hands, and that's a signal for talent. Noel also saw some rushing production, which actually is in my prospect model and does get some signal. So all of that put together, I just think he's a really solid player who can play at the very least. He should be able to play a slot role at the next level. But I think that there's a possibility. Now, my statistical objective comps within my prospect guide and my model saw Jaylin Noel. His top one was Randall Cobb, which is obviously a great one. But then there was like Sky Moore and like some questionable guys that were sitting there. I mean, we're talking about a probable round 3 pick, so things aren't going to be all butterflies and rainbows. But I do think if you want to think of like an archetype, a ceiling archetype for Jaylin Noel, I do think that it's a little Amon-Ra St. Brown-esque, where he's going to play, he's going to play the slot as his sort of core foundational place. but he can play inside out a little bit if that ceiling really does hit and his game does translate. I don't want anyone to take that as like that's a comp for him, but I do think that that's sort of the style that we're looking at with Jaylin Noel.
Do you have a kind of ideal landing spot for Noel?
Off the top of my head, I don't. Anywhere. I mean, for most of these guys, it's like anywhere where there's a solid opening. I'm down for. Like I think even a guy like ARSB, we forget, but like a player like that, he might not have emerged the way that he emerged if not for going to the landing spot that he did, where there was literally nothing else in Detroit. Where sometimes that happens, right? Where these wide receivers otherwise might take a couple years, and even when they take that time, we don't know what's going on mentally with them and how they're feeling about the game and sort of like the stuff that's a little bit more difficult to measure. So I do think that helped a guy like ARSB. So I'd say anywhere where there's like an obvious opening at wideout, even if it's a New England or something, even though they do have some slots, like I think that could work for him.
Yeah, that makes sense. Rich, you wrote in your rookie guide 20 years ago, a player like Noel wouldn't have found a home in the NFL, could have been limited to 2 or 3 gadget plays per game, but now the NFL's different and you should be able to find a role much easier. How positive is your outlook? Are you with JJ on this one?
I really like the player. I think it's, as JJ said, his floor is like a slot receiver that gets some use on special teams, gets a few of those kind of end around jet sweeps, gadget plays. He's going to have a role in the NFL as an NFL receiver. Whether that makes him fantasy relevant is a different question. And I think this is where I think slot types are so much more landing spot dependent than, like Noel's teammate in Jaylin Higgins, in terms of Higgins could go in to 32 NFL teams. And if he is talented enough, if he can earn the snaps, he's going to be fantasy relevant. Just as a player that's going to play 80-90% of snaps as an outside receiver, he will earn enough targets to be fantasy relevant. No, because we're saying he's likely he is a slot only receiver. If he lands in a bad situation that maybe doesn't use 11 personnel heavily, he could only be on the field for 60% of snaps. Even if he's good in that role, that makes him less fantasy relevant. So for me, I really like the player. I love the explosion ability. I love a good route runner, and this guy can get separation for days. But I just have that slight concern around as long as he gets draft capital, as long as he gets a coach that I think is going to use him in creative ways, I'm excited to draft him fantasy. But pre-draft, that expectation and hope is slightly tempered than it is for kind of a prototypical outside receiver.
Yeah, I think there's still so many questions about the wide receiver class and how far some of these guys are going to fall, because it sounds like plenty of NFL teams just aren't really into this class and aren't looking to fix problems immediately with them. So whether Noel gets on the field or not immediately, maybe he's somebody who, like Amon-Ra St. Brown, can contribute down the back end of the season. We're going to get to player 2 in just a moment. But if this is your first time finding us here in the Fantasy Sanctuary, hit the subscribe button down below. We've got loads more great guests lined up to talk about rookies that they want to draft, as well as rookie profile videos. And of course, myself and Tyler, we're in the best ball streets every week. So moving on then, JJ, we're going to get to a guy who I've heard you talk about in a few podcasts, DJ Giddens, running back out of Kansas. Didn't even start playing football until his sophomore year of high school, but since then he's given people plenty of reasons to be excited. I know he's becoming kind of one of your guys you seem to want to talk about a lot. Is he somebody that you're most excited for Dynasty in 2025 and beyond, or redraft? Do you think he can have an immediate impact?
Look, I think there's a possibility that he can make an immediate impact. I don't think the draft capital is necessarily going to match, what we would typically want to heavily invest in from a redraft perspective. There are some really good running backs at the top of the class that we're going to feel a lot, more comfortable with. But, I like Giddens. The one thing that I'll say about both of the guys that I'll talk about at running back, but the one thing I'll say is that, when it comes to like pass catching ability, I do think that, the way that I sort of categorize these guys, and this is a really, really, it's almost binary. It's close to binary, but it's, I look at the guys, they're either really, really elite pass catchers, the Christian McCaffreys of the world when he came out, or there's plenty of red flags for them as pass catchers. Like just obvious he's not going to catch a lot of ball. Maybe he had a best season of 3% reception share or something in college. Those guys just never, ever end up being pass catchers at the next level. But I think that there's like a massive group of players who are sort of in the middle where they may not be elite, but they can at least, maybe they'll be able to see a 10, 11% target share at the NFL level. And that can sometimes be enough as long as that workload is there in that particular offense. I sort of see Giddens in that bucket. It's the most, prevalent. It's the biggest bucket of the three for sure. But I do think that he's sort of in there. If you look at, what his numbers looked like in college, he had a best season, 11.2% reception share, which is solid. It's not like elite. It's not even, I wouldn't even consider that great. Usually I'd say great is over like 14% or so. But over 10% is usually solid. It's not a big reason to be concerned. And then I also use a metric called breakout score at running back, and it's actually calculated the same way that I calculate the wide receiver one, which is age and program adjusted receiving yards per team pass attempt. I actually no longer in my model use any rushing metrics at all because it's typically captured within like draft capital and some of the other metrics like size and stuff that, or speed score that I'm looking at, elsewhere that's not production related. But Giddens actually had a breakout score of 78, which is solid. So this is based on his receiving yards per team pass attempt, at a younger age or when that age happened and how old he was, and then the program strength that he was in the program that he was playing at Kansas State. And then he did that. So he had decent enough receiving numbers. I don't want to call them elite receiving numbers by any means, but they were decent enough. And then you look at his size, 6 foot, 212. He goes out the combine, and I don't care about measurables really at wide receiver, aside from the fact that they can impact draft capital to some degree, and draft capital does matter. But, at running back, I do care about speed score. I care about weight adjusted 40 times. And DJ Giddens at 212 goes out and runs a 4.43 40. He had a great speed score as a result. He's just one of those players where I feel like if he had that combine in almost any other class over the last like 5 or 6 years, we would be talking about him more. It's just that this class is really loaded. We had a lot of good combines and a lot of good 40s from these running backs, and no one seems to care that much about Giddens as a result. But, typically if you want to think about this in like a really, really like almost Neanderthal-y type way, if you just look at running backs and say big, fast, can catch ball, like that's someone that we should be paying attention to, generally speaking, right? And then I had this in my prospect guide. This is sort of like a have some fun with numbers type things by looking at some of the parameters that DJ Giddens hit. Now, granted, when you do an exercise like this, you have to remember that I'm looking at more of the minimum thresholds or the maximum threshold for Giddens numbers, whereas the other guys in this class or in this group that I'm about to share, they were better than where Giddens was at. But regardless, there were only 9 running backs in my model's database who had a speed score of at least 110, a breakout score of at least 75. Remember, Giddens was at 78, and a best season total yards per team play above 2. Okay, so they're fast at their size. They had a good breakout score, so they were getting good receiving work at a younger age / at a decent program, and their best season total yards per team play was above 2, which is usually a mark that we see the elite running backs hit at some point in college. Here are the players that hit the marks. There's 9 of them: Todd Gurley, Ezekiel Elliott, Joe Mixon, Leonard Fournette, Saquon Barkley, Jonathan Taylor, Najee Harris, Breece Hall, and Kenneth Walker. I mean, it's a pretty good group to be a part of, right? Yeah. I don't think the draft capital, like I said, is going to be where those other guys were, but it is nice to have a player that sort of comps loosely to some of those studs.
Yeah, like when I looked at DJ Giddens' stats, like the thing that stood out to me about his pass catching, it's almost a bit reminiscent of a player like J.K. Dobbins, where you're not saying he can't catch the ball. He's just one of these guys who it's not his best attribute, perhaps, and he's somebody who, if the ball's featured towards him, he'll be okay and he can add something. But he's just a really fun player, and like you mentioned, the speed is just, it absolutely shines when you watch him. Rich, where are you at on DJ Giddens?
I really like Giddens. I think it's difficult because I think there's probably going to be 4 or 5 backs that go maybe early day 3, maybe late day 2 that I'm going to sit here and say I really like them. And that just speaks to the depth of this class. Like I think for me, yes, the physical attributes stand out, but I was really impressed with his vision. I think his ability to, manipulate defenders, press a hole, make the cutback, and go down different is really impressive. And I think that's what's going to help him get on the field early. On the receiving point, I think, I've put on the screen here, not a value add receiver. I think that can probably be read as a negative. But I think what I'm trying to say there is that, to your point, JJ, I think he's fine as a receiving back in checkdowns, in the screen game and things like that. Is he going to flex out wide and, break down a linebacker to get open? Is he going to be used huge amounts on angle routes and things like that? Probably not. But we can probably count the amount of running backs that truly are used like that on one hand in the NFL right now. I think that, if you're an NFL team and you're looking at it and saying, do I want to spend, a round 2 pick on Judkins or a Henderson or someone like that, and then to get a 4th round receiver, or do I want to go and spend, a 2nd round pick on one of these receivers and then come back and get someone like DJ Giddens in the 4th round? To me, that's a really easy, decision. And I think that I worry with this draft class, because there's so many good backs. I feel like the NFL are going to start to go, why do I have to spend a 2nd round pick on this guy when I can get someone like this in the 4th round? And I do wonder if that drops draft capital for the entire class, because there are so many good options potentially in day 3, like Giddens.
Yeah, some of the sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but some of the comps, just to give you like context of like total agreement from like a pass catching standpoint. His top 3 statistical comps were Cam Akers, who you can kind of make a similar argument with, Tevin Coleman, another guy who had that good size speed, and Marlon Mack, where it's just they're players who we've seen get decent workloads in the NFL. And granted, like from a comp standpoint, those might not sound great. But again, we're looking at a potential late day 2, early day 3 type running back here, where if you're getting that kind of production from that player as like a more of like a median, we'll take that all day long, where there's still a ceiling there because of that athleticism.
And Akers and Mack both had worse careers because of the injuries. We're looking at their careers as a whole. Both of them had horrendous injuries. If they hadn't had that, their statistical profiles, their fantasy output might have been even better.
Above all else, you just want players who, they don't have complete stone hands. They're not having to be taken off the field because they can't catch whatsoever. Like, you don't want guys like Gus Edwards there. If you can catch a ball even to a reasonable level, it just opens up the ceiling so much better. And just going back to your point, Rich, about the strength of the depth of this rookie class, that it might push some of these running backs down. I think also that you can see the other side of that sometimes, and we've seen it with wide receivers in recent years, but teams have got it in their head that they want to get a wide receiver at a certain point. They want to get a running back, and that creates a run on them. And then everybody starts to panic and you start getting trade ups, which if we start seeing trade ups for certain running backs, I know that's going to send people crazy about them, because they're going to be thinking this team went up and they went and got their guy. This is somebody who we can rely on for year 1. So I think the draft is definitely going to be incredibly interesting for all of these guys. And our next prospect, who is Jarquez Hunter, running back out of Auburn. I mean, JJ, we've talked about it extensively. This running back class is good, but if it wasn't as deep as it is, do you think that Hunter is somebody who might be getting more pop? Because for the minute, he seems like somebody who's kind of not creating as many headlines amongst the draft community and the fantasy community as some of the other guys.
Yeah, I'm kind of surprised that at least in the fantasy community, we're not seeing it a ton, just because the fantasy community is going to be a little bit more numbers based and analytically based. And if you look at what Hunter did versus the rest of the class, he was 5th in career avoided tackles per rush. He was 9th in career explosive run rate. He was 9th in career yards after contact per attempt. And that's within a class that is elite, right? Like that's a really, really good class. So I think in other groups and other classes, like Hunter would probably be in the conversation in the top 10-ish. He's not right now because it's just so deep, but I think he's solid. He might not have had the most spectacular receiving totals at Auburn. He sort of goes back to that like middle tier bucket that I was talking about before, where a lot of those where a lot of the running backs just will end up landing as just kind of like whatever pass catchers, not bad, not good. But again, if you look at his raw receiving totals, Auburn didn't throw the ball much at all. They just don't, especially while he was there. He actually had a breakout score, which again is based on receiving yards per team pass attempt, that was 3rd best in this class. And it's confusing because he had a reception share a best season reception share of just 10.7%, which means, you know, he wasn't seeing few amounts of receptions, but it wasn't like a crazy number of receptions that would drive up his receiving yard total. What really happened was that at a younger age, sophomore year, he had a decent number of receiving yards because he was efficient with his catches. And that translated to a really strong breakout score. Obviously, also doing it at a program like Auburn is really solid. And if you look at the rest of the ZAP model database, that's my model's name. If you look at the rest of the database, the only other running back that had a high breakout score like Hunter and a lower best season reception share. Now, both of those numbers, the breakout score for this player was higher and the best season reception share was a little bit lower. But the only player who kind of comped from a receiving perspective, similar to Hunter, was Kenneth Walker, where, you know, coming out, Walker had a lot of like, you know, he's fine as a pass catcher. That's not really his bread and butter. But as we saw last year, like he can still kind of do it. Like he can get in space on the, you know, whenever they, and like a swing pass or something, and allow him to use that athletic ability that he has and create a home run play. I see that not that they're the same kind of player at all. You know, Kenneth Walker was a lot more prolific, you know, as a rusher in college. The size profiles aren't like that dramatically different, but I do think that Hunter, you know, at least has the ability to be okay as a pass catcher at the next level based on that breakout score. And again, his size, 5'9", 204, not the biggest back in the world, but he did go out. He ran a 4.44 40. The top comp for him in the model was Chase Edmonds, but I think that we're probably looking at a better, a little bit more athletic version of Edmonds. And again, people hear that name, they hear that comp, they're like, oh, I don't want to, I don't care about that player. But like, we're talking about a day 3 guy. I mean, he's almost definitely going to go day 3. We're talking about a day 3 player where Edmonds is a top comp. Like Edmonds has had opportunities in the NFL. Like he's been able to climb depth charts at times.
He's been fantasy relevant.
Yeah. And that's all we're really asking for with like a day 3 player. I just think there's a little bit more juice with Hunter than what we saw with Edmonds.
Yeah. And I love your point about Chase Edmonds, because it's so easy to get swept up further down the line when you look back at a player's career and you remember the year where they washed out and you drafted them at too high of a cost and it didn't pay off. But when Chase Edmonds was good, it was down the stretch those years where he suddenly came into a big role and thrived. Rich, do you think that there's teams that Jarquez Hunter can land on in year 1 where we could be looking at things post rookie bye week bump, week 10 onwards, where a team is fighting for their lives and just checking the ball down to Hunter enough and keeping him on the field for those hurry up drills? Like, are there any teams that stand out to you as I would love to see Hunter land there?
I think there's 32 teams, isn't there? Because I think once we're talking week 10 down the stretch, it's basically an injury away type guy. And I think that, you know, you could paint a picture of him ending up on any team where there's the lead back gets injured and Hunter comes in. And yeah, he's not like a true 3-down workhorse, but he can absolutely do a bit of everything. I think his ability to break tackles and, you know, as I said on the screen, run after contact, it's fantastic. And I think that will enamor him with coaches and help him get on the field. I guess we might need to get Tyler to check in on this though, because rule of cool, no gloves. Like I'm not sure I can live with that. So, but yeah, I really like Hunter. I think, you know, for me in terms of film grade of my numbers, I think he's in a similar bucket to a lot of the guys that are projected to go round 4 in terms of Devin Neal and RJ Harvey, DJ Giddens, Trevor Etienne, stuff like that. I think he's in that sort of bucket. It seems based on mock drafts and stuff that the NFL's viewing him sort of a tier down. But yeah, if you're talking, this is a guy that I can potentially get in like middle to late 3rd round of rookie picks. This is the perfect profile of a guy I think you should be taking a punt on, because I always say, you know, in those later rounds, you should be attacking the volume-based positions like running back, as you said. Even if he ends up as 3rd back on a depth chart, there's a world where there's an injury, he gets on the field, he carves out a role, and suddenly he's far more fantasy relevant than we ever dreamed of.
Yeah, JJ, like I know you kind of got deeper into best ball last year. Is Hunter someone that you'd like to be drafting in best ball post draft? Like one of these guys who could just have the ability to change a game in an instant? Is that the kind of player that you want to take late round flyers on in best ball?
You know, I think that if he finds a spot where, you know, the starter, you know, as long as he's the RB2, I probably wouldn't be drafting him in best ball if he ends up being an RB3, you know, team RB3. But if he finds a spot where, you know, the starter's a little bit questionable, we don't know exactly, you know, what's going on from a workload perspective. Yeah, I mean, like, he would be able to slide in. I just think that any day 3 back at this point, like if you're especially if you're drafting right now, don't be overly confident in your ability to project where these guys are going to go in the draft. Post draft though, if we find a decent spot for him and if he's a day 3 back, sure, throw the dart. I just, you know, we do have to be realistic about like the actual hit rates for these day 3 guys. It's not strong at all. Even if we see a guy or two like come out and give us RB2 production or RB3 production in a given season, to assume that you know who that guy is going to be, you know, it's a little bit of an arrogant way to play, you know. So we have to be open-minded, you know, and not think so black and white about this stuff. But I will say that, like, of the possibilities on day 3, of the possibilities of who those running backs might be, you know, you're obviously going to trim your consideration set a little bit and not have as many, because there's going to be a lot of day 3 running backs. I think Hunter will be part of that conversation for me because I do think that he has the right skill set to translate.
Yeah, I love that. And like you say, there's so much to be decided and so much of a range of outcomes on these players. One thing is absolutely for sure, though, JJ, your rookie guide is impeccable for anyone who needs to do research on these rookies. Anyone who hasn't got their copy already, how can they fix that?
Yeah, check out lateround.com. Just click guides at the top. Ignore my ugly mug whenever you first hop on the site, but click guides at the top and you can check it out. It lists everything that's in it. It's 160 pages of just pure nerdiness if you're into that kind of thing.
Well, we very much are into that nerdy kind of thing. And if you want a copy of our rookie guide that Rich has slaved away on, hit the join button down below. Silver tier upwards, get a copy. It's incredible work by Rich and well worth it considering you'll pay less than the price of a coffee per month to join our channel, not to mention everything else we bring you here. We'll be back with more of your favorite fantasy football experts talking about their favorite rookies very soon. But in the meantime, go and watch this video where Rich did a Superflex rookie mock draft complete with landing spots, and we'll catch you soon.